Good evening, everybody. My name is Joe DeLosa of the South Bay Branch Library of the Palm Beach County Library System. Welcome to a Thursday night edition of Writers Live. And we can get right to it. My guest tonight is a writer, activist, professor at Augsburg University in the Department of Religion and Philosophy. He is the host and creator of the acclaimed narrative podcast Unread, all 4 episodes of which are available now on your preferred podcast platform. And he's the author of 2 books, Faithiest, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious, and the book we're going to be talking about tonight, IRL. Please join me in welcoming Chris Stedman. Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
Chris, thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out. I'm so glad you're here because this is a really fascinating book. It speaks to a lot of things that I'm thinking about as I think about my relationship with social media. And there's a lot to get to. And I also want to talk about the Unread podcast, which is a really lovely companion piece in a lot of ways to IRL, which was really remarkable, and definitely want to ask you about that. But let's start with IRL. Let's just take a broad view first. The book title, IRL, that alludes to the separation of our internet lives and our real lives. And I guess, what are your thoughts on that separation? Is that a false dichotomy?
Yeah, so the phrase IRL stands for in real life, and it originated as a phrase to kind of designate between this supposed difference between our digital lives and the experiences that we have offline. And I think at one point that phrase made a lot of sense. I grew up with a very different internet than the internet that we have today. I did not have the internet at home growing up. My experience of the internet was getting on my bike, biking to the nearest library, and logging onto one of the public computers for about a 30-minute window before I had to move on and it was someone else's turn. And so, with that experience of the internet, where it was really this sort of set-apart activity from the rest of my life, I think that distinction made sense. The internet was an activity, not something that was sort of woven into the fabric of, really a great deal of my life. But that's not the internet that we have anymore. I carry the internet around in my pocket at all times. It's often the very first thing I look at in the morning and the very last thing I engage with before I go to sleep at night. And the internet really is a sort of huge part of how I show up in the world, how I learn more about the world around me, how I connect with, both sort of forge new connections and maintain existing relationships. It is, truly I've moved over the years bigger and bigger pieces of my life into digital space. And so I think that this way of thinking about the internet, which is really baked into how we think about online life, that it's this sort of less real or set apart sort of thing, I think doesn't really work for the internet that we have today. And I think one of the sort of consequences of thinking about the internet as being less real or not as real as other parts of our lives is that we don't take the digital pieces of our lives as seriously as we do the other parts of our lives. We don't hold ourselves to the same standards online that we do offline. We don't apply the same kind of scrutiny to our digital actions. And so this space that is increasingly a huge part of how we sort of explore questions of meaning in our lives, how we forge connections with people around us, isn't necessarily, not only do we not kind of expect the same things of ourselves in digital space as we do offline. I mean, how many of us have had maybe a more brusque interaction with someone online and then told ourselves, it doesn't really count. It's not, it's not real. So we don't, sort of apply the same standards, but also we're not using digital space as this, sort of opportunity to reflect on and learn more about ourselves and the world around us, which I think it's actually this really rich space for exploring these sort of central questions of what it means to be human. So, as you heard in the introduction, I teach in a Department of Religion and Philosophy, and that might seem like a strange person maybe to write a book on the internet. But the reason I ended up becoming really interested in the internet, besides my own sort of personal relationship with the internet, which we can definitely talk about, is that I started to observe that more and more people, especially young people, are moving the parts of their lives that historically they've explored and wrestled with in institutions like religious spaces, questions of who am I, what is my responsibility to the world around me, etc. they're sort of moving those out of institutional spaces and into digital ones. And I found myself both curious and concerned about how that shift was impacting our understanding of what it means to be human, which ultimately is why I wrote this book.
All right, so what are some of those concerns you have about that shift?
Yeah, so we were talking before the event about, when it comes to sort of views on the internet, the two groups that I think we hear the most from are the kind of pessimists and the optimists. So there's the people who think that the internet is the most incredible thing that's ever happened, that it's going to completely change who we are for the better. These sort of tech optimists who think that, if we just sort of make every piece of our lives digital in some way, then we'll have a much better experience of life. And then there are the sort of naysayers who say that the internet is making us more polarized, lonelier, more anxious and depressed, that it's having these sort of tremendously negative impacts on both the individual and the sort of societal experience that we have. And I found myself, this was a big part of ultimately why I became so interested in this question, that I ended up going on a several-year exploration that led to writing this book. I found myself leaning more and more toward the pessimistic side, and feeling less and less, or more and more disenchanted by my own digital experiences and the impact that the internet was having on the world around me. So when I started this process, I definitely was feeling more pessimistic about the impact of the internet on our understanding of what it means to be human. But as I think the book makes clear, as I sort of went on this search, I found myself moving more toward the middle. Not in the sense that I sort of lost touch with what the sort of concerns that I have about the internet's impact on mental health, on polarization, all of those things, but rather I found myself sort of coming to terms with the fact that the internet is not going anywhere. It's increasingly, if anything, just going to become more and more a part of our lives. And so if the internet is here to stay, one thing that we do have some control over is our relationship to it and how we think about it. And I think that if more and more people took our digital lives more seriously, if we thought of them as being, real life, then I think we could move our relationship with the internet in a more positive direction. And just to sort of bring it back to a religion thing, I teach at a Lutheran-affiliated university. So even though I myself am not Lutheran, I am surrounded by them and am deeply influenced by Lutherans. And one particular Lutheran who I thought about a lot as I was working on this book and kept coming back to again and again was a theologian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He lived in Germany at the time of the rise of the Nazis. And he had this idea that Christians have a responsibility to live as if there is no God. And what he meant by that is that it was his view that Christians shouldn't expect God to sort of intervene in the face of injustice in the world, but rather Christians had a responsibility to act on God's behalf in the world. And I found myself, and just for anyone who doesn't know sort of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's entire life story, for him that commitment meant he took that idea so seriously that he actually attempted to assassinate Hitler, and that's ultimately why he was imprisoned and killed. So definitely took that idea to the max. But I found myself thinking a lot about that sort of as if idea, how we live, as if something is true or not. And I think this as if orientation we have toward the internet, that we think of it as if it's not real or it's less real, really shapes a big part of what our digital experience is. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have the internet that we have today, which I think is definitely a less than perfect internet. And I think if we started treating it as if it was real, regardless of whether or not we think it is as real, real in the same ways, etc., as the other pieces of our lives, I think that shift in our relationship to it and our orientation toward the internet would have a big impact on ultimately the internet that we have.
Now, when you say the internet we have today, do you think that the social media environment that we have right now is different than the one maybe a decade or two ago? I believe we're about the same age. Oregon Trail in elementary school,
Sure, yes.
Nokia brick phone.
In the computer lab, yes,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, really simple.
Exactly.
And like, so I remember when I was in high school, we had LiveJournal, we had Zonga blogs.
Oh yeah,
Zenga.
I had a few that I think are hopefully gone forever.
No, and I think when I first entered my freshman year of undergrad, that's when, well, you had to have a .edu email address to have a Facebook account.
Exactly.
And when I signed up, they just rolled out the news feed that, and that was when a lot of people were saying this is a little creepy. Maybe I will quit Facebook, and apparently that didn't happen. There's something quaint about that social media compared to the social media we have now. It didn't feel quite as ruthlessly, algorithmically designed to, prey upon our vulnerabilities and press our buttons in a way that Twitter and YouTube recommendations are designed to make us angry and designed to press our buttons and prey upon what will capture our attention, even if it's bad for our soul in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
Is this social media environment just uniquely bad? Like, could the old social media era, would that have been better for us if that had stuck around?
Yeah, so you took the words right out of my mouth, in the sense that the internet that we have right now, particularly the social internet that we have right now, is one that preys on our vulnerabilities, our very human vulnerabilities. The thing about the algorithms that these social media platforms utilize is that they don't have a sort of particular agenda. They're algorithmically agnostic. They don't, they're not really, it doesn't matter what content rises to the top. The content that they're going to prioritize is the ones that users have the most response to. And so what do we as human beings tend to respond most to is, things that make us angry, that make us upset, that make us anxious. So right now, that neutrality that these algorithms have harms us because, it moves us in directions that ultimately, are these sort of human frailties that we have. And so, yeah, the algorithm doesn't care what you're looking at, it just cares that you're staying online. The longer you're online, ultimately, that's a win for these platforms, because even though social media feels like public space, and once upon a time it really did function more like that, it is private space. Social media platforms are privately owned. They're run by companies that ultimately have the priority of making money, and so they're going to, what they care about is keeping users online and keeping them engaged. And if what keeps someone online longer is, content that enrages them, that polarizes them, that radicalizes them, that upsets them, then that's what the algorithms are going to prioritize. So ultimately, we can change our individual relationship with the internet, and I think, that is truly one of the biggest things that we can do as individuals. We need a systemic transformation of the internet that we have today. I make a parallel in the book to climate change. I can change my individual relationship with the planet, and that can have a positive impact on me and the experience that I have. But ultimately, the fact that I choose to walk more or bike more or those kinds of things is not going to have the kind of systemic impact as long as there are 100 companies responsible for the majority of carbon output. What I do as an individual isn't going to change the system. And so we need systemic transformations of these platforms. They ultimately cannot be these for-profit spaces, because inevitably they will continue to prioritize, and the little changes that they make are truly just little stopgaps. They're ultimately not addressing the core issue. But that we don't have to have this internet. We can have a different internet. It's just that it can't be it can't be privately run by these companies. And so, in the meantime, the relationship that we have with this internet is kind of up to us. And we were talking a little bit before the event about your own sort of relationship with the internet and how you're reevaluating it and reassessing it. And I think ultimately that is the most important thing that we can do. And that's the shift that I really advocate for in the book, is to stop thinking about our online lives as not real or less real, and to take them seriously. And the book doesn't end with this sort of, here are 10 things you can do to have a better digital life, because the internet is always going to be changing. And so I can't say these are the 10 sort of tips to having a more real online experience. What I can say is here's a kind of orientation or attitude you can have toward the internet, one that is critical and where you're asking yourself questions. I mean, these platforms are designed to get us to use them mindlessly. Again, that's sort of what keeps you online longer. But we can ask ourselves when we pick up the phone and pull up Twitter or whatever, why am I opening this right now? What am I looking to, what need am I looking to meet? And there was a study that I reference in the book out of Utah, where they did this 8-year longitudinal study at the University of Utah. And they followed the same people for 8 years, and one of the key findings that they came away from in their study is that people can spend the exact same amount of time online and have radically different experiences of the internet, which really flies in the face of this sort of common, more pessimistic idea that the longer someone is online, the more radicalized they'll become, or the more anxious they'll become. And the study found that the sort of key difference between someone who had a more negative experience online and someone who had a more positive experience was whether or not they were being intentional about what they were using the internet for, what needs they were trying to meet, whether they were using it more mindfully or more mindlessly. And so mindless use ultimately is a win in the for-profit sort of structure of social media, but we can use social media more mindfully, and that is one thing that I have tried to apply to my digital life. I definitely can't stand before you and say that I have it all figured out when it comes to my relationship with the internet, because again, it's not about 10 simple steps to having a better digital life. It is about an attitude and an orientation, which is something that you ultimately have to sort of always be working on.
Yeah, I should say that in our conversation before the show started, I'm definitely leaning heavily towards the doomer side of it.
Yeah.
I've been trying to kind of give up social media, or at the very least, give up creating social media content. Like, I'm a creepy lurker. And one of the things that actually was a catalyst for me to stop trying to contribute to social media, or stop adding material, is that I used to jokingly say that social media would be a lot better, Facebook or Twitter, or Instagram, if before you could post anything, a dialog box popped up that asks you, why are you posting this? Like, because when I started asking that question of myself, I didn't really like the answers I was getting, if I were honest with myself, like, why am I posting this? Because I want the people to think I'm a good person, so I'm going to post quotes that make me seem deep and insightful, or I want to get the attention of somebody whom I have a semi-secret crush on, but for whatever reason I've chosen to do this instead of just talking to her. Like, a lot of things made me feel a little pathetic, when I was honest about myself about what my intention was for posting things. And what do you think is the intention for most people? Like, I don't know if I'm alone in that, when I felt like my motivations for posting things weren't the best, or could be done in a better way.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I came to feel that the internet was actually one of the sort of richest spaces we have to better understand ourselves is because of this. Because I think if we ask ourselves honest questions about why we're doing different things online, sometimes it reveals things to us about ourselves that are uncomfortable. But ultimately, I mean, that's the only way to really know who you are, is to ask yourself those uncomfortable, honest questions. And I think, we have, when I was younger, the internet was this powerful connective tool for me. I talked about biking to the library when I was an adolescent. A big part of why I did was because I was, a closeted gay adolescent in a community where I saw no one else like me, but I could go online and I could find other people who I could come out to for the first time, where I could do it in a low stakes way because it was a digital stranger, and if it didn't go well, I could just close out of the window. Whereas if I came out to my mom and it didn't go well, that would be much more high stakes. And so for me, the internet was this connective lifeline at a time when I really needed it. And it was also this sort of horizon expanding space where I could see that there was a much broader world out there than the small town that I was growing up in. But now the internet that we have is and those sort of relationship that many of us have to the internet, and of course we all have very different relationships to the internet, but you know, whereas when I was younger, I spent a lot of time alone, and then I would step into this connective activity online. Now I'm connected all the time, and actually what I need is to disconnect. Actually what I need is time alone, because while connection is centrally important to our experience as human beings, you know, we have as human beings these core needs. We need food, shelter, water, but we also need meaning, we need belonging, we need to feel as if our lives amount to something, we need to feel as if we have people who care about us. You know, those are things that we truly need, but we also need time alone. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time feeling bored, feeling restless, and it was in those moments when I would find my mind wandering to unexpected places. I would find myself having ideas that I, you know, would never have had otherwise. I remember even, you know, I didn't get my first smartphone until I was in my 20s, and so I had experiences even in adulthood of sitting waiting for a bus, just feeling completely bored, sitting in a doctor's office waiting room, and it was again in those moments where I would either have like a really surprising idea, or my mind would wander to some uncomfortable thought I've been trying to push away with busyness and distraction. And I think one unfortunate sort of consequence of these, you know, having this sort of worldwide community in our pockets at all times is that it's easier to not spend time alone, to not spend time feeling bored, or to let your mind wander to those uncomfortable places. And so, you know, I talk near the end of the book about taking this sort of digital sabbatical. So I took a 3-month break from social media near the end of writing the book, in part because I've been reflecting on, you know, what it means to be human online for years while still being online, and thought, oh, I probably should also have this experience of being offline and see what sort of comes up. But also because, you know, the book was due in a few months and I really needed to focus. And when I went offline, I really had this experience of withdrawal at first, where I found my friends said I was texting them in tweet format and that I needed to stop. And I, you know, found myself feeling really like this, I was really missing this thing that had been really important to me. But then, you know, after a little time passed, I felt this immense sense of ease and peace. And again, it would almost sort of seem to confirm this idea that the internet makes us more anxious, you know, that it makes us unhappy. And initially that was kind of what I thought. I was like, oh, maybe there is something to this. But then I realized that what I was experiencing was essentially the same thing as going on a retreat or going on vacation. Of course, you feel more at ease, more peaceful when you've sort of disconnected from your life and from the needs of the world around you. Life is uncomfortable. Life is anxiety-inducing. We feel anxiety about things because we care about the world around us. And again, to bring it to religion, I found myself thinking of Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monastic, or he was a Catholic who initially thought he was going to enter a monastic life and sort of live his life in retreat, but ultimately changed his mind because he came to feel that the value of retreat, of disconnecting, was that it gives you the space to recognize the things you need to recognize that then bring you back out into the world and into connection. And so I think we need time offline in order to recognize those things that are uncomfortable, those things that, you know, maybe we try to avoid with busyness or with trying to make ourselves look better or all of those kinds of things. But I also think that that can bring us back into a different relationship with social media, maybe one that is more self-aware.
Yeah. You mentioned your relationship with the internet as a kid, as a closeted gay kid. One of the things that stops you from going full doomer on social media is that I recognize in a lot of ways it's a privilege to be entirely dismissive of social media. Like, if you're able to say like social media is completely worthless and it's a mistake for humanity, that probably means that you did not at any point in your life need to seek out communities and people who can support you, which probably means that you weren't a member of a marginalized community. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about social media that I think is important to remember is it's so new, and we are really in the early stages of this huge sort of technological shift, really one of the biggest shifts in the history of human civilization. And this is, I'm going to be a little, like blunt with this parallel. Obviously, there are many nuances we could get into in the differences between them, but I find myself thinking a lot about the printing press when I think about the internet, and how the printing press completely changed how we share information, how we connect with one another, and how in the beginning, the printing press was a very imperfect system. The printed word was very imperfect. Only the most privileged and powerful had access to and really controlled how the printed word was used. And there was definitely, an experience, there was a loss with that shift as we shifted away from sharing information sort of orally, person to person, through the written word more, because sharing information verbally creates a kind of connected experience that you don't have when you're just reading words on a page. And this is not me knocking books. I love books. I write them. Books totally saved my life when I was younger and needed to see this broader world beyond what I knew. But it was a change, and we are still in the very early stages of that shift and the powerful control, the platforms that we use to connect digitally. But as you were suggesting, for many people it has had a revolutionary impact on their lives. For the first time in human history, many people are no longer sort of limited by accident of birth when it comes to who they can connect with. You're able to go online and find people on the other side of the world who, maybe have a shared identity or a shared passion or that sort of thing. And so community no longer has to orient around, family of origin, the town that you grew up in. It can revolve around shared interests. It can revolve around shared identities. And that is a really powerful thing for many people. And the book is full of stories of people who have had that kind of experience with the internet, who, I was fortunate enough that they shared that story with me. Again, before the event, we were talking about...
It was just a really fun time before the show started.
We were trying really hard not to talk about everything that we were going to talk about here, but we talked about the opening metaphor or opening image of the book, because the book, basically in each chapter I use a different operating image to explore a facet of digital life, because our digital lives are so woven into how we move through the world these days that they can almost render themselves invisible to us, and it's kind of like being a fish in water. You don't sort of see, you can't really step back and see what's going on. And so I tried to use these other metaphors or images as a way of reflecting on one aspect of digital life or another. So ultimately, like a map, it's just a representation of who we are. It's not the full picture. A map can't include every detail of the territory it's trying to capture, otherwise it would be the size of the territory itself. And likewise, we have to sort of choose what we share and what we don't share online, just like a map maker does. That was a fun, actually, example. I spent a ton of time in the map library at the University of Minnesota, and that was a fun example of a metaphor that I thought just meant one thing, but ultimately actually functioned on a level that I didn't even realize, which was, cartography, maps. We sort of look at maps, many of us, as if they're just simply a neutral representation of a place, but they're not neutral. They reflect the interests of who made the map, and so whoever makes the map decides what's important to show and what's not important to show. So, and usually the people who are commissioning the maps tend to be those who are in positions of power. So if you look at a map of Germany from a couple centuries ago, you're seeing the king's vision of Germany, not the peasants. And likewise online, we're all sort of mapping our lives with these tools that, the people in positions of power have decided this is what's important for you to show and for you to not show. Anyway, the opening image of the book is drag performers. I write about being at an amateur drag night, watching these drag performers who were, most of them, this was their first time performing in drag, and finding myself really charmed by amateur night because you sort of see two extremes on amateur night. You see the person who really has no idea what they're doing and is like totally making all kinds of mistakes, and there's something very sort of there's something very real about that, which is the book sort of ultimately wrestles with this question of what it means to be a real person online. There's something very genuine about that comes out when you're trying to do something that you're not good at yet and you have no idea what you're doing. And then there's the other sort of extreme that you see on amateur night is people who are really taking big swings. They're trying something really, really out there, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but they're trying something, kind of daring. Whereas if you go to a drag performance by someone who's really polished and has been doing drag for a long time, they've kind of figured out, okay, here's what the crowd will like. I'm going to give this performance that I know that the crowd's going to respond to. They're maybe not taking such big chances. And I think online we're all performing a kind of drag. We're all performing a version of ourselves, but it feels like because the technology is so new that we're all like at amateur night. Maybe we don't know what we're doing yet, maybe we're making lots of mistakes. I feel that way all the time online, but also sometimes we're trying something we're taking a big swing and maybe, trying something new that really shows us a new part of who we are. And drag as an art form is ultimately not supposed to sort of represent reality. Drag performers aren't trying to, what some say, pass. They're not trying to sort of move through a crowd unnoticed. They're actually trying to exaggerate, dramatize in order to shine a light on our conventions about how, about gender, how we think about gender and presentation. And online, I think we are often performing a heightened version of ourselves, but that can shine a light on all of the sort of unspoken conventions that we have about who we're supposed to be. And so, the reason I bring up this is A, we were talking about it before, but B, that's one of the things that, when it comes to sort of marginalized experiences online, I think I found myself thinking a lot about, in particular, the LGBT experience with the internet, because for many LGBT people of my generation, the internet was the first place they were really able to connect. But I also think that to be LGBT is to have to kind of wrestle with a lot of questions about what it means to be human, and ultimately many of those are a lot of the same kinds of questions that I think our digital lives present to us as well, in part because of this drag performance, I think, image. In
the chapter about maps and cartography, you drew an interesting parallel about Pensacola in particular, how it was, I should speak in the microphone, how it was like a diverse city until gentrification took place, when more affluent people realized that maybe it would be nice to have a house on the coast, right, and priced out a lot of the more working class or impoverished members of the Pensacola community. And taking that analogy to the digital space and social media, do you think that in some ways what was once a safer place for like LGBT and other marginalized people is becoming less safe and less welcoming? I'm thinking in particular of like accounts like Libs of TikTok.
Yeah, that was immediately what I thought of.
Yeah, or any number of like aspiring conservative influencers who there's like a cottage industry of taking out of context TikToks and other social media posts from people in the LGBT community, taking it out of that place and presenting it to an audience in a hostile or misleading way. Is that happening to marginalized people on social media? Are they sort of experiencing a hostile gentrification online?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the beautiful things the internet has provided people is with these sort of micro communities online where you can find, a safe space that maybe you're not finding in other parts of your life to explore who you are. And but the danger, the risk is that those things can then be taken and shared with a much broader audience, as you were describing. And absolutely, I think that parallel between that is a parallel in the book between the internet was once a space that was much more for marginalized members of society, and now has really been sort of taken over by moneyed interests. And but I also think so. In the book, I talk a lot about this book that I absolutely loved that was specifically on our climate change and on America's coastlines. And that's where I learned about Pensacola. And one of the things that's super interesting about America's coastlines is that at one point, coastal land in the United States was considered very undesirable. It was swampy, nobody wanted to live there. And so, more marginalized members of society ended up often living in coastal land. But then, as technology evolved and we found ways of making coastal land more livable, whether it was filling in land in order to, so that it wasn't so swampy, or sort of building houses that could withstand, a more swampy environment, then people wanted to move to these coastal lands. But what we didn't realize was that there were all these unintended consequences to changing the natural habitat by filling in land and all of that. And so, as a result, a lot of ecosystems were devastated, and so now efforts are underway to basically try to restore this coastal wetland to its original state. And likewise, it sort of comes back to, I think, what you were talking about earlier. I think more and more people are recognizing that we had an experience of the internet that we no longer have, one that was, as particularly meaningful for marginalized individuals, but that has now been, sort of corporatized and turned into basically our leisure time online, the time that we spend online trying to maintain relationships, learn more about the world around us. Connect has now been turned into time, into an activity that ultimately makes money for somebody else. And I think that, there is and should be a pushback to return to, a different kind of internet. I don't think we'll ever go back to the internet that we once had, but I think we can, try to move the internet more in the direction of, particularly recognizing that it is a space where a lot of people who aren't able to, find the resources they need around them are able to go and make sure those people are protected.
What do you think is the effect of the perceived permanence of what we post on social media? How does that affect the way we engage with social media? I'm thinking in particular young people and kids and teens. I remember, I had various blogs back in the day, and as you pointed out, I'm glad they don't exist anymore. I intentionally picked blogging services that I had a feeling would go out of business, and they did. And I'm very grateful for that, because I had dumb opinions as a teen, as one does. And I don't think that kids and teens have that same luxury, especially with the normalization of using your real name on the internet. It's much easier to attach what you've written in the past and have it follow you. How does that affect how we engage with the internet and social media?
Absolutely. This is a thing where I feel so grateful that I grew up in the precise moment that I did, because I have so much empathy for young people today who are growing up with a very different internet. And, I absolutely, was using the internet to explore, to, try out different ideas, different personas, different personalities, that, ultimately, if someone were to build an entire image of me based on just that one moment, I wouldn't be super thrilled with that. Because, as we all do, I've continued to grow and change, and that was a part of, the sort of journey to getting to where I am now. In the chapter of the book that wrestles with this question of permanence, I use tattoos as the metaphor. I have a lot of them. But tattoos are really interesting because, people always have asked me over the years, won't you regret that tattoo that you got when you were 18 or whatever? And I did, my first tattoo I got when I was 18, and it was, it's on my right leg, and it's of a stalk of wheat with a Bible verse. And at the time, I was a Christian. I am not any longer. And at one point, I looked at that tattoo with regret. I thought, why did I get that? No one should allow an 18-year-old to get a tattoo. They don't know who they are yet. But over time, I came to have a different view of that tattoo, because it represents an important place in my journey to becoming the person I am now. And I I don't want to sort of disavow or forget that person. That person has, made me who I am today. And so, my relationship with my tattoos today is, I don't really stress about how I'm going to feel about a tattoo in the future because it represents where I was in that moment in time. And tattoos aren't as permanent as I think we sometimes think of them as, not only because you can get them removed, you can cover them up, but also you can change them. I have a few tattoos, and I read about this in the book, where, maybe how I thought of that, the thing that I got tattooed at that point in my life was, is maybe I look at it really differently now. And so, with those tattoos, I've gone back and added details to them to kind of change my relationship with them, rather than trying to get rid of them or pretend like that wasn't who I was in that moment in my life. And so likewise, one of the things that I hope that the strange permanence of the internet, and not everything online is permanent. We lose so much digital content every day. And so it's not as if everything will be captured forever, but I hope that it, rather than, feeling like this thing that sort of imprisons us and forever ties us to some past version of ourselves in a way that feels bad, I hope it'll help us collectively shift our thinking around, what it means to be a human being who changes, who grows, recognizing that that is a core part of what it means to be human. To, be wrong-headed at one point in your life, to be foolish, to be hurtful to other people. These are not, individual failings. They are a fundamental human experience that we all go through. That doesn't mean that we're simply absolved of any wrongdoing, but it does, obviously we need to sort of look back at and reflect on mistakes that we've made in the past and, try to learn and grow and address harms that we've caused and all of that. But I think, we ultimately all have, said and done things that we would be embarrassed to have broadcast to the world. And so I hope that ultimately this will shift our understanding of, the fact that this is just a part of what it means to be human, and this is part of what makes us who we are, and that's how we grow, that's how we learn. So my hope is, we'll develop better ways of preparing young people for the gravity of online life, to say that this is real life, that what you're doing online is consequential and it matters, but also that it will help us become more comfortable with the fact that as human beings we do change and grow.
Before we open up to audience questions, I did want to talk about the Unread podcast, which is lovely. It's very genuine and heartfelt. First, let's talk about that.
Sure.
What's the podcast about, and why did you decide to tell this story in podcast form?
Yeah, so I'll sort of try to very briefly describe what the podcast is about. So it's a narrative podcast. It's just a 4-episode limited series, and it's so actually, really, it was like right when I was finishing Unread, finishing IRL, I had just turned it into my publisher about a week before this happened. And so I was just really kind of re-entering the world, because remember, I had been on this social media break, so I'd been totally sort of offline, disconnected, and I was just coming back online when one night I got an email from one of my closest friends who lived, far away from me, saying that he had ended his life. And it was a scheduled email that he said he had scheduled it to go out after. It was definitely one of the worst and most shocking moments of my life. I, tried to sort of, in the initial, when I got the email, I tried to scramble because at first I thought, well, maybe this was scheduled, but he had changed his mind, or he had not been successful, and so I tried to scramble to see if I could find him, if I could, check and make sure he was okay. Ultimately, I learned that he had ended his life successfully. And in the email, it was an incredibly horrifying email to read. It was also a beautiful note from him, expressing his love, explaining his decision. He wanted me to make sure that he wanted to make sure that I knew that he knew that I cared about him. So a lot of the questions that people are left with after losing someone to suicide, I had answers to in this email. But it also included this very strange detail near the end, which was he included a link to a private web page that had audio files of him talking to someone he had met in an internet forum, in an internet chat room, who sounded exactly like Britney Spears, the pop musician, who ultimately was his most favorite person in the world, really. He knew everything about Britney Spears, absolutely loved her. And he didn't give any context for it. He just said, by the way, here's Alice recordings. And she went by the name Alice online, this person. And so, in the months after his death, I was helping his family plan the memorial. I was raising money to help cover the costs related to his death because his family wasn't in a position where they could cover them. And I was, wrestling with my grief and all the questions that I had about, how it had happened, why it had happened, my feelings of guilt, a lot of the things that people wrestle with after that kind of loss. But I also found myself coming back to these audio files and really trying to understand why he included them in the email. Because like I said, the email really addressed kind of a lot of the questions I would have had. But then there was this piece of information with no explanation given, no context. And I truly wanted to understand what it was about and to see if I could find this person ultimately, because he couldn't obviously answer why he had included them, but I thought maybe if I could find her, this person, I could find out what this was about. And he was a person who was larger than life. I mean, he really, when I think about the people who have changed me and changed my life the most, he was truly one of the first people that would come to mind. In fact, I even, back years ago, I was in therapy one day and my therapist asked, who are the people you feel you can be most yourself with? And he was the first person that came to mind for me. And it was really because when we met, even though I had been out of the closet for a long time, I still was feeling a lot of the after effects of being in the closet, of this feeling that I needed to sort of tone down who I was, that I needed to make myself smaller, to hide certain pieces of myself, to not be too colorful or loud. And I met him, and he was the most colorful and most loud person I ever met. And so he showed me, ultimately, that it was okay to be more, to take up more space like that. And so when I think about the people I knew who were the most real, really, I thought of him. And so, in a way, I'm a skeptic at heart. I tend to question everything, and tend to kind of dismiss anything that feels too fantastical. And so, my reaction to getting those audio files was well, there's no way that's Britney Spears, obviously. But I think I was maybe trying to embody his spirit a little bit and to let myself wonder, what if it really was Britney, that maybe he had really connected with his idol online. And so the podcast ultimately is this sort of dive into his digital life after his death, but ultimately I think it's this exploration of the kind of uncertainties and questions that you're left with when you lose someone, and how the internet functions for so many people as this space where they can find resources and connect with others when they truly need to.
Yeah, it's genuinely beautiful.
Thanks.
I'm very sorry for your loss, but I'm also...
I don't understand, I may have erroneously read the description of this talk, of your talk, so I really respect it. But what I'm confused about in your regard is, I think there's a confusion here on the premise that we're saying the internet, in terms of the topic of this conversation, and social media. I do not equate the two. For example, very simply put, to me, the internet is a tool from which I extrapolate. Hopefully my research ability is pretty good. I have a fair amount of education. Spent my whole life in graduate school and have a master's and then another equivalent of a PhD in pedagogical subjects, which are boring anyway. I'm kind of, I almost want to be a public intellectual in a way, because I personally believe that the whole social media thing, well, I eschewed it immediately about 10, 15 years ago. May I just speak a moment about this? Because I do not associate social media with the internet. The internet, for me, is a tool, and maybe I misunderstood the description of the talk. To me, it's incredibly important, and I want to ask you, do you see it as a tool? You've already shown that you do in your search on shoreline information. There, to me, is the essence of an example. Everything else to me is pure, I don't know what to say, like it's the algorithms that are commercial, you pointed out, and all the other junk that people are absorbing. And I've seen...
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt, but I would argue that, like, yeah, certainly the internet is not entirely social media, but it represents such a large portion of the usage of the internet. And you could argue that social media is itself a tool as well. What do you think, Chris?
Exactly, that was what I was going to say. I think social media is a tool, but even, the internet, like the sort of search tools that we have online are not, they come with some of the same algorithm trappings that social media does. I mean, Google, prioritizes certain search results, and so they aren't just these sort of neutral tools, but they are, I think, ultimately tools. And I think that they can be, we have access to more information now. Just any individual who goes online has access to more information than, anyone has ever had in the history of human civilization. And that can be a profoundly empowering and powerful thing. It can also be a dangerous thing. I mean, because, especially when it comes to sort of media literacy, there are a lot of people who have a hard time recognizing what is truthful information online and what isn't, because often untruthful information is made to look like it is truthful. And so, I think that these tools, whether it's, the internet, whether it's, our ability to find all kinds of information online, or even social media, which I think can be a powerful tool when it comes to these human needs for connection, for finding community. I mean, one thing that I found that was really encouraging was, so sociologists tend to put the, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but when it comes to the kinds of relationships that we have, they can be put into two large buckets, that are close ties and our weak ties. So our close ties are the people we're closest to. In my case, it would be my mom, my best friend, and those are people who, no matter what tools are available to us, we will maintain a connection to them. So if I woke up tomorrow and social media was suddenly gone, my best friend in New York and I would become pen pals and we'd write letters to each other. We would find a way to stay connected. But most of our relationships are not close ties. Most of the relationships we have are weak ties. They're people who we meet once maybe, and then we go our separate ways. But because of social media now, we're people who would have sort of passed out of our lives in the past, we would have never seen them again, can now stay in our orbits. And that is actually a very powerful thing. If part of what it means to be human is to have access to more information, to expand our horizons, because close ties tend to share our worldviews very, very closely. I mean, it makes total sense, right? The people we're closest to would often see the world in the same ways that we do. Our weak ties tend to have, very different views of the world often than we do. And it turns out that our weak ties on social media can introduce us to perspectives, information, et cetera, that we would never have come across otherwise. And absolutely, that's been my experience on Twitter. One of the things that I've loved about Twitter for years is that I've been able to curate a following, people who I follow, who expose me to all kinds of information and ideas that challenge me, that, you know, show me another way of seeing the world. And so, again, you know, these are tools, but unfortunately they're not sort of just neutral tools. They're tools that have embedded agendas in them that we ultimately need to root out in order for them to function in ways that I think are better for us.
I think we're coming up on our time. Did anybody have another question?
Question?
Thank you.
My question is, you're talking about social media being run, let's say, by the money people. Who do you want to run it?
Yeah.
Government? Is that any better than the money people? Government?
Yeah, well, right now, I would say, and I'm pretty clear about this in the book, that unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to that question. I don't feel qualified, for one thing, but I do think that, we, just like we have other public utilities to meet sort of fundamental human needs, whether it's the need for water, the need for electricity, I think that moving in the direction of the internet being treated more as a public utility rather than a privately run space would be a better move. But I mean, I share. Well, I don't want to project, but I have concerns about the government doing any better of a job, in part because of money in politics. I mean, ultimately, money is the core issue, both in the private sort of corporate running of the internet and in money in politics influencing how these things play out. So, but the truth is, any sort of great change that we've seen in human history has happened incrementally due to many, many people pushing and pushing and pushing for something better, not something immediately overnight perfect, but we can definitely have a better internet than we have right now. I think it's a long road toward an internet that is absolutely free of the influence of money, but I think that, and maybe we'll never get there, but I think we could get definitely to a better one. I'll just leave it at that because I know we're running
I'm just curious, because you keep saying the money people.
Yeah.
And I understand, it's like, well, okay.
What's better, yeah.
Well, small groups, and you gotta make sure they stay true to their cause, because once money plays in, all you need is two people who want the money.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, for me, that's, when I look at our political realities today, I mean, the biggest challenge, I think, likewise, just like in social media, the biggest challenge that we face in our democracy right now is the influence of money. And so, I would love to say yes, the government is the solution to this problem, but I don't think it is. I think there are so many systems that need to be reformed, that need to be improved. This is one of them. But yeah, I also think the alternative is just to say, well, then nothing changes for the better, and I have to believe that we can continue to move things in a better
Can I just say
direction.
one thing? I would also think, and it's just my opinion, when people are younger, you have to teach your children how to use this internet and everything better ways.
Absolutely.
Better ways, what are you looking at? This is ridiculous, don't do this. I don't know how else to explain it. Like, bullying is one of the biggest things on social media.
Absolutely.
It's very damaging. Unless you train or teach your child kindness and thought before you put something in writing.
Absolutely. And this is where,
Picture.
people like to put a lot of the blame on social media for the things that we do online, but the truth is we created social media. It's a reflection of who we are. It's a reflection of our values and our priorities. And, if we see things that we don't like online, it's because they're things that make us, uncomfortable about human nature. And so ultimately, encouraging people to lead more intentional and reflective lives is a really important thing to do. My sister-in-law is a teacher in middle school, and she, for example, to get back to the thing about what's true online and what's not, she does units in media literacy where students have to look at information online and figure out whether or not this is legitimate information or not. And all of those kinds of things are really important, but so are the considerations of how we treat one another online, or what kind of information we disclose or don't, how we keep ourselves safe online, all of those kinds of things that I think are critical for young not just young people, people of all ages
Yeah,
think
but
about.
I feel it starts teaching them young, because I'm much older, there was no computer or anything when I was a
Absolutely.
kid, but now the kids are on it, so you gotta teach them very young. How to, I don't even know how to.
Well,
Right.
it's such a powerful tool
Yes.
that it can be incredibly positively empowering, but it can also be incredibly damaging because it's so powerful. And so, you know, I definitely think, I don't have children myself, but I have nieces and nephews and friends with children, and you know, I think if I were raising children, I probably would not, they would not have internet access immediately. There would be a period of time where they would have an offline life first, and they would, you know, learn certain habits or certain ways of thinking first before then they had access to this powerful, very powerful tool.
Hey, well, guys, that's our show. Chris, thanks so much for hanging out today. I really appreciate it. And thanks to you all for hanging out with us this evening. Really appreciate it. Just a quick reminder that copies of IRL are available for purchase right over there. And Chris will be hanging out to sign copies.
And if you join Friends of the Library, you get a tote bag, am I right?
Yep.
Yeah, so you can take it out in a tote bag.
My goodness, Chris, you're on top of it. You're on top of it. I love it. I do want to say thanks to my colleagues Aaron, Christina, our Director of System Services, Adam, and my branch manager, Graham. And thanks to you all again for hanging out with us. For more Writers Live events, you can visit our website, pbclibrary.org, click Learn More under Writers Live. If you'd like to offer some thoughts about tonight's interview, you can do so on our website as well, pbclibrary.org/survey. And if you would like to support library programming like this, you can visit pbclibrary.org/friends to donate to the Friends of the Library, or perhaps become a member and get that sweet tote bag. Again, I'm Joe DeLosa. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Have a good one.